Hi there, and welcome to Ella Merrill. My name is Merrill, and I like to do deep dives into the latest research on neurodiversity.
And I'm Alistair. I'm a psychotherapist, and I love creating the metaphors and stories that help make sense of it all.
And together, we're exploring how neurodiversity shapes our lives. Let's get started.
This episode of Alan Merrill is brought to you by my co-pilot AI for when your willpower won't. You know, those 2 a.m. moments when you're supposed to be going to sleep, but you can't stop doom scrolling. Or when you're stuck on the sofa with your phone after work. Well, my co-pilot AI is your personal AI co-pilot that can help you get on with the things that you really want and need to do exactly in those moments. Whether that's doing the laundry, getting on with your projects or hobbies, or just actually going to bed, my co-pilot AI can help you with all of this. Check it out at https://mycopilot.ai. That's mycopilot.ai for when your willpower won't.
Just a note to say that we're explorers and storytellers. This podcast is not intended as therapy, advice, recommendation, or medical authority. We are just like you, inviting you along on our journey of trying to make a little sense out of fascinating research on neuroscience and neurodiversity as best as we can.
So hello. I gather we've got a change of topic today.
Yeah, with respect to what we said last time, because I didn't have so much time to read this week. What I did do instead was, so I had a bunch of articles that I have read already some time ago, so that didn't take me any time this week, and that I had made notes of previously. I basically read through these notes and to see if I could find other interesting stuff to discuss. And one thing that I found was these GABA neurotransmitters that we talked about. So basically, to recap, found a higher glutamase GABA ratio in people with autism. People with autism had less GABA, and this ratio between glutamate and GABA is important in the brain. And there was much more glutamate present in the brains of GABA related to GABA. And this has a huge effect on the cortical hyperreactivity and heightened behavioral sensitivity. GABA is a neurotransmitter, and it's important to downregulate the activity of other neurotransmitters in the brain. And if there's less of it, then other neurotransmitters explode in the things that they're doing, leading to hyperreactivity in parts of the brain, hypersensitivity, those kinds of things.
And if I remember rightly, I think my analogy for that was the batteries that power traffic lights. The cars, all the other neurons, all the stuff that the brain wants to do. But if you let all the cars race and run amok, you just get traffic jams and things pile up and everything goes horribly wrong. But if you put traffic lights, you can smooth the flow and make sure that things go where they need to go in an ordered fashion that's not too crazy. But the traffic lights run on batteries, which is the GABA. So if for some reason those traffic lights are a bit bust, then you might see a lot of GABA floating around, those batteries that aren't being used, and you see a lot of racing cars, which is the hyperactivity in the other neurons.
Yes, and probably this ratio between the GABA, which is lower in people with autism, and glutamate is important for this brain regulation. So relatively, there's higher glutamate. Now, I found another article in my pile of things that I had read before, talking about the glutamate-glutamine cycle. Glutamine is a thing and glutamine is a thing. Glutamate is produced from glutamine via glutaminase, consistently named. Yeah, so glutaminase is an enzyme which is transforming glutamine into glutamate. This is a cycle because then glutamine is converted back into glutamate by some other thing. So it's kind of being transformed back and forth. And this cycle appears to be super important for neurotransmission. So this cycle is required for neurotransmission, so for the activity of the brain.
I mean, this is how the brain really works in many ways, isn't it? It's things going in circles, but the activity at one point in that circle has sort of knock-on effects and influence on other things. So it's actually not the stuff that does this that has the impact. It's the conversion of the stuff. It's all the changes in neurotransmitters that really is kind of the behavior, the phenomenon that underpins, like, you know, our reality, our experience, our psychology. So somewhere in there, presumably, either at one point in that cycle or potentially multiple points in that cycle, it's by doing that, facilitating a core process that neurons need to do to be neurons and do neuron things.
So this glutaminase, this enzyme is required for this process, right? It's required for putting glutamine into glutamate. There's two types of glutaminase. There's kidney type and there's liver type. I looked up whether that means that it's generated in the liver or the kidney. That's not the case. It's generated from mRNA. So basically in all types of the body. Anyway, there's two types of glutaminase and it doesn't refer to where it is created because it's created everywhere in the body, but it refers to its function. So in the metabolic process of the liver type glutaminase is used, and in the metabolic process of the kidney type glutaminase is used. But in many other parts of the body, such as the brain, there's also glutaminase required for metabolic processes, such as this glutamate-glutamine cycle. That's also a metabolic process. Also, these kidney type and liver type glutaminase is used in the brain. Also, there's not a brain type glutaminase. There's still a liver type and a kidney type glutaminase, which are used in different parts of the brain for the processes done there.
So glutamate is, so you know how neurons, like, they don't actually touch each other. Like, they don't physically touch. They sit really close to each other, and there's like a gap between them. And basically, this cycle is what transfers like the excitation of the neuron across the gap. So if you think of it as like electricity, I guess, is it electricity exactly? But within the nerve cell itself, you get I think it's like calcium and potassium ions, or like it's sort of ions like that, and they cross the boundary of the nerve fiber. And as they go outside and inside, you change the electrical potential inside the nerve itself, and then you get myelinated sheaths for much of it, so that these places where it goes across the boundary are like separated by a bit of distance. But when it gets big enough at one kind of like gate, the potential goes along far enough to make the next gate also trigger its process. So the spike moves along the nerve and it goes much faster because of these gaps. That's what happens inside the nerve cell. And then it gets to an end, or like there's a synapse. It has to get across the gap. I think glutamate is, because this is now different chemistry, it's not trying to propagate inside a nerve. It's got a different way of transporting that excitation from one to the other. And that is the glutamate cycle does that. So it basically sends stuff across, and you need to clear the glutamine. You need to clear the glutamate, I think, so that the thing can stop exciting, because you don't actually want the thing to stay excited. When you do like a brain scan, you see the electrical energy like pulse along. It's not on and then stays on.
Right, so it needs to go on and off, so it can keep doing the thing instead of staying on.
A light switch, you switch on and it's on because the electricity flows through it. Brain doesn't work like that. It's more like
That's what the glutaminase does, is transform it back into Okay, the glutaminase is transforming the glutamine into the glutamate, and then there's another thing which is irrelevant, which is transforming it back into glutamine.
There's a little bit in the middle where there's a thing called an astrocyte, so you've got in the presynaptic neuron, you've got the electricity spike or the excitation spike, and I think that releases glutamate. That then gets taken up by an astrocyte, where that gets converted into glutamine and moved across to the boundary of the postsynaptic neuron, so the thing that's going to carry it on, and that takes up the glutamine. And your enzyme is in the astrocyte, and then glutaminase converts it back
from glutamining to glutamate.
That's in the neuron, and that gets pumped back and gets shoved back out across the gap so that the presynaptic neuron can pick it up and do stuff with it.
I think that was correct.
Yes. Okay, so one of the benefits of doing this is that the presynaptic neuron, I think, can create glutamate, but by converting it back and recycling it and sending it back over, basically it's energy efficient. Like, you don't have to keep creating loads of glutamate. You can convert the stuff back. So it's like a reuse cycle. And I think if you just have loads of glutamine flying around, it damages the neurons. I have no idea why or how, but it damages them. So potentially, if you don't clear it up, it's bad for your brain, right? So epilepsy, I think, that's, if you don't clear it and you excite too much, that's an epileptic. Like, that's neurons going bum 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 bum, because the glutamine, it's like a feedback loop in a speaker. You put a little sound down it, but then it hears itself and it sends that sound round and round and round and round and round again, and you're like, I didn't put any more sound in, but it's hearing itself through a microphone speaker. So if you leave the glutamine there, then it just keeps hitting the next cell and triggering it to go boom, 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 boom.
So that was the introduction on how this cycle works. There's kidney type and there's a liver type, and different parts of the brain use different types, either one of these types for their processes. This study found a 34% lower kidney type glutaminase in the anterior cingulate cortex, or ACC.
Now, I know what that does. I did it.
34% lower glutaminase. So this kidney type glutaminase is the type of glutaminase in the ACC, which is used there for these processes. And there's a 34% lower of it, meaning that this glutamate-glutamine cycle is being executed much slower, I guess you could say. There's less of this process, and there will be much less glutamate.
Much less ability to excite, so it can't do its job properly. Like, these neurons might want to be like, I've got a message to pass on, but they're like,
And there's not enough.
I don't have a letter. I don't have any paper. I mean, I'm going old school letters here rather than emails. Or they're like, I've got an email to send, but I don't have any Wi-Fi.
Yeah, my internet connection is unstable.
Basically. Okay. And the anterior cingulate cortex, so that's all frontal lobe area, high functioning regulation of pretty much everything.
What it does is important for integrating and regulating emotional response. It's for understanding other people's emotions. It's involved in the fight or flight reaction. It's in the perception of pain. It's in the handling of emotional pain, motivation and reward assessment. All of these things are done in this, not specifically done, but this area is very important for these kinds of processes, which very much correlate with the things that people with autism or maybe ADHD are struggling with.
I think the prefrontal cortex, like my own way of kind of talking about that is that it kind of creates models, mental models.
Expectations.
You could have a neural system that is just reactive, right? It's just input, output, input, output. That doesn't need a model. It doesn't need to kind of like build and this doesn't have to be a conscious model. Like, it could be unconscious, but it kind of builds a higher level, a conceptualization of something. And then it kind of uses that to work, which is if you start not just reacting to the rain when it's there, but you can start perceiving that it's going to be raining because you see the signs, right? If your brain, and this is like, lots of animals do this, right? You see the signs and you go, it's going to rain. I should probably get to high ground, or I'm going to look after myself. But I think that then happens with everything. Like, so human beings just do this. And actually what's really interesting is I think there's some research on computer games that this doesn't happen properly. So there's like a loop where your brain takes in information, like really basic level, like let's say visual, and that goes through a basic first level salience filter where actually a lot of it gets thrown away. And then there's a process where, and I get the steps wrong, but roughly the gist is you kind of take in the information, you prune out for what's most important, and then you kind of create a mental model of it. That then suggests potential actions, and then you kind of like prune those for sort of desired outcomes.
Select the best actions from those.
Yeah. And also like inhibition and stuff, where you're like, oh, don't do that because that's actually like socially not acceptable or whatever. So your brain's capable of inhibiting the first impulse, and then it basically works out like an execution strategy, like that then implies like movement or saying something. And this is where we start becoming conscious of stuff, is often after this process has happened, where we're like, oh, I want to do this. It's like, well, your brain decided that before you knew, but you start and then you do something with it, and then you sort of take it back in and test, did it have the desired outcome? And that's like a loop. But the point here, what's really fascinating, is that if you play computer games, because a computer game is not a chaotic world in the same way that the real world is, like you can game a game. Things that when the baddie does this, you just do this. You just react with a response, and people who are very good at computer games often aren't really thinking about what they're doing. They're just doing it, right? And you can show that when like teenagers have been playing computer games for a while, they do half the loop. They don't do the first half of the loop, where they basically take the information in, they work out what's salient, and they do like a basic model, but not a full model, like a half model, which is what's the rule. And then as soon as they have that, they act a response. I mean, this is research that I read like got to be 10 years ago. But the take home there was people were kind of worried, because like what was also happening as a result was that these young people that they were finding this on, we're really struggling in ordinary life, like, for example, dealing with a cashier at a supermarket, because actually that's so complicated that you have to do, your brain has to build like a model of the world, and it's got to be rich, and you don't really get rules because there aren't really easy rules. Like, there are natural laws, but they're actually quite hard to understand, and they're quite complex and quite deep and quite subtle. So we make up simpler rules. And that's what like being a human being is massively about, learning these sort of shorthands, our own shorthands for these really deep, complex natural laws. And if you don't do that, you cannot function. That you just can't function in the world, and you shut down. And then you're more likely to disappear back into computer games because you can win at that, right? So you can, it's not just the dopamine win, it's my brain can understand this. And if you don't encourage that in teenage years, I think there are quite a lot of consequences to that, because we learn how to do this. We really need to train our brains to do this. So a lot of the education system and parenting models should be really encouraging youngsters to really develop the entirety of the loop, but computer games specifically really undermine that loop. And I think the prefrontal cortex that we're talking about here, and that anterior cingulate cortex, if my memory serves me, is all wrapped up in there somewhere. You can't deal with the world in its full experience. Like, your brain isn't powerful enough to process all that data. It has to make the data more reasonable about. So it first gets rid of loads of stuff that it thinks is really unimportant. And there's loads of hilarious psychology experiments that show how people do that. Like, stuff that's really obvious. People like don't see it. Like, they just don't see it. And then you show it to them and say, did you notice like the gorilla walking in the basketball court? And there's a video of a gorilla walking across a basketball game and goes, and then walks off. But you've been told to pay attention, to count the number of passes between the red team players. So even though this blindingly obvious gorilla walks, like, the number of people who actually see the gorilla is really small. It's like less than 20 or 10% or something really small. That's your brain filtering out, going, yeah, your eyes took that in and went, not important. So you'll prune it first. And then this cycle is super, super important. So I'm kind of thinking back to glutamate stuff. If that's being dysregulated, then model building regulation is at risk. Is that kind of what we're seeing here?
Yeah. The understanding of the world, the evaluation of that world in sense of like translating the actions and the consequences of the actions and the actions of other people and the emotions of other people into things a person can understand and put into perspective. And
I wonder if, like, because RSD for ADHD is so rejection sensitivity dysphoria. And we talked about that a few sessions ago around norepinephrine being like a threat thing.
involved in fight or flight.
I'm wondering also whether there's a potential here for, like, the hyperactive response that we sometimes get with ADHD in particular, where like maybe it's because things aren't firing enough that we almost like panic internally and we don't know, and then we overreact to make up for it. Because I'm pretty sure that, like, if there's a part of the brain that's supposed to be doing a job and isn't, then other parts of the brain will try and step in and help and compensate. So I'm wondering whether some of the experience of ADHD neurodiversity around the prefrontal lobe isn't just the struggle with it intrinsically, like, but actually the sort of the second order reaction to that struggle.
The compensation resulting from inactivity in parts that should be dealing with it, you mean?
Something like that. I mean, that's jumping 2 steps ahead, but it's a sort of plausible mechanic that at a high level is the sort of thing that we do. Because, like, the cerebellum we were talking about a while ago, there's the trade-off theory that I kind of found I'm very interested in. Same kind of idea. It's like, when stuff doesn't work, how does the brain compensate for that? And a lot of what I see in the neurodiversity behavior, lexicon, they all seem to be compensatory behaviors. They're not, it's not just people walking around being dumb or like just not doing.
Rather doing other things than
Yeah, and trying
most other
to
people.
handle and deal with the fact that they are struggling with the thing. And a lot of the pain, actually, like, if you couldn't do something and you didn't know and it didn't matter, you'd just be like, I just don't do that. But we get really pissed off that we can't do stuff and that we're frustrated and we're thwarted and we're like, and it's so irritating. And then we do things wrong and we like try and it doesn't work. The experience is so much both of those, isn't it? It's the struggle, and then the fact that the way that we try and cope with the struggle doesn't really solve it either, and that's just bloody irritating.
You were already starting about the cerebellum, and I was curious whether the ACC is connected to the cerebellum, or specifically what parts it's connected to, like what the connection is between the two. And the parts of the cerebellum that are connected to the ACC that have a transport going on there are basically exactly the ones that I found in other articles that say the parts of the cerebellum that have reduced gray mass in people with autism and ADHD. So there's other articles stating that the gray mass in the cerebellum is reduced in people with autism and ADHD, and they specify in which areas that is the case, which corresponds to your trade-off theory, I guess, that there is less gray mass, or there's less capacity to either build this area or maintain it, if we're talking about neuroinflammation.
I mean, so just as a little reminder and a recap, the cerebellum is super interesting and hasn't been like mad studied, because I think neuroscientists were first interested in the neocortex and the limbic system and the hypothalamus, and the cerebellum was seen as this part of the brain that was like just responsible for motor stuff, and some quite a lot of neuroscientists still think that, so that it just does. Regulating, when you see like an AI train a car to race around a track, or they get those images of they're training up bodies to move and robots to move, and they're like completely uncoordinated and sorry, that was a bit prejudicial. So they're like really uncoordinated and chaotic in their movements. And babies are a little bit like that too. But as adults, if I want to reach for a glass of water, I just do it, right? And the cerebellum, we've known for a long time, helps smooth out the impulses that come in that go, hey, I want to reach over there, into an action that is known to be achievable and smooth and sane. And that's how we're able to move skillfully in this world. And we've known it does that for ages, but because we knew that, neuroscientists were like, I'm not going to pay too much attention to this because we know what that does. That just does that. And now, in the last sort of 10 years, I think, we've been discovering, actually, do you know what? It does this same smoothing function on behalf of other parts of the brain as well, including the higher parts of the brain, like the prefrontal cortex. So there's a very good chance that the prefrontal cortex generates a certain amount of excitatory structure, right, in response to stuff, and kind of sends it to the cerebellum to go, hey, can you smooth this out, and then send it back in a sane way. Here's what I want, give me the output, rather than thinking it through. But the problem, of course, is if the cerebellum can't do that properly for some reason, whatever reason, right? And that could be injury. It could be shutdowns from trauma. It could be genetic. It could be neurological, as in you just don't have the stuff because of developmental conditions. Either your brain can't build that or didn't for some reason. Then the rest of the brain has to do it, right? That compensation thing we were talking about a minute ago, it's that same process. The neocortex goes, okay, if you can't solve this for me fast, I'll have to solve it by thinking it through. But your brain is limited in energy. So sometimes you get areas where your brain just goes, hey, I'm going to do a basic job here, but I'm not going to be really good at it. But then other areas, it goes, I need to be really good at this for reasons. And that really will depend on the childhood environment that you grow up in and what's important to you. And also where your bigger deficits are elsewhere. So the big ones that I think get lost a lot are time, various regulation things, time, also memory goes, because these are really expensive, difficult functions. And I think there might be reasons why they're already at risk for their own reasons. So the brain just goes, I can't really do short-term working memory. That's really hard. So I'm just going to give up on that. And if your brain does that, you're gonna be dyslexic. That's the label we give those people because of the experiences that they have. And if it's social stuff, which is very common for the cerebellum, it's used a lot in managing social behavior and regulation, then you're going to be labeled autistic. And if you've got stuff going on with dopamine in the basal ganglia and your executive function, which again is also regulation in the prefrontal cortex necessary for that loop, you're going to get the label ADHD. So this trade-off theory is basically wherever the cerebellum, or to the degree that the cerebellum isn't able to do its job, and the degree that other organs in the brain are already at risk for other reasons or genetic reasons or developmental reasons, the brain has to make trade-offs, energy trade-offs, to keep itself running, and it hyper focuses on some stuff and it dumps some other stuff. And the prefrontal cortex is so important in regulation of various things that it's kind of in that mix. And I think if you could work it out, or do scans that really show it, I think, I have a little hypothesis that you'd be able to see the trade-offs that we make kind of in the decisions that you'd see it somehow. If you could label each bit that does it, which I don't think is how it works, but in a conceptual space, if you could label it, I'd be you could probably track the whole brain and go oh, this person's brain is not doing that, and doing that. This person's probably going to have a label of dyslexia.
Because it will be doing something. It's not that it is shut off or just inactive or not doing anything at any moment. It will be doing stuff, but it will be doing something else than in neurotypical brains, for example,
Yeah,
if
I
we're
think
talking about.
the level is is it doing it good enough or is it doing it hyper? Those are the two possibilities that aren't, normal. And normal is, actually normal is another definition of good enough. Because your brain doesn't become a super genius at something if the cerebellum can pre-process it with a good enough strategy. So then I guess maybe you've got a good enough, hyper, which is you really attend to this because for some reason as a child you thought that this was really important. Maybe it got you away from the drama of your family environment, which means you could switch off your emotion stuff, which was overwhelming. So maybe you like playing crosswords and numbers games because it's safe and you can win and you get your dopamine kicks. And then there's baseline survival. So, your working memory might be shot and really poor, but it'll be good enough to survive. And that's the only bar the brain needs, right? Good enough to survive. Difficult experience to have. Yes. Okay. So that was just a little quick recap on the trade-off theory, me trying to weave it into the prefrontal cortex a bit.
The point was, I guess, that the parts that this ACC is connected to are specifically the parts where we see reduced gray mass. And this means that there's less computing capacity in those areas. The cerebellum, just like the rest of the brain, has areas, and each area is responsible for different things.
Yeah, I think we can talk like that. I think this, people are moving away from that model a little bit.
Really?
I think for the purposes of this conversation, it's probably fine.
What I thought was all areas of the brain have kind of a baseline function, that all things that you do happen in specific parts of the brain. But if that part of the brain is either has less gray mass or is just failing, I don't know, if you get a tumor or whatever, a specific part is not working, then other parts of the brain can take over, but that will take some time.
Yeah, and it'll be done differently.
For it to be taken over?
You're cooking, and you really could do with a steamer to steam your veg. Ideally, you'd have a steamer.
But you could also boil
or
it.
you could use a sieve, and you could jerry rig something using some different stuff, and be okay, I'm gonna, my pot's broken, but I'm gonna put them on this stuff in a pan that's wide, so you can still get the outcome, but it's
Exactly.
harder.
But it will be less effective.
And less efficient, and the brain has it's trying to regulate itself with minimum amount of energy, so it would rather use the neurons that are really good at doing that to do that, right? You use the tool that is most helpful to do that in the most efficient way, but that doesn't mean that the tool and the thing are the same thing. I think there are certainly areas which are hyper specialized, for example, with memory and doing place. There's I can't remember the name of it, tip of my tongue. Just before your hippocampus, there's an area of cells. The hippocampus and memory is a fascinating part of the brain already. So much stuff happens there, but really in small areas. But there's an area that has hexagonal mapping. So the neurons represent hexagons in the world, and when you walk across the room, they fire in sequence where you are, backwards and forward. Now that maps you in space. You can't do that anywhere else. If your brain lost that, you would be stuffed for doing that type of mapping. So that is hyper specialized and hyper specific. So I think saying something like, a brain does everything, like I did a minute ago, is too general a statement in itself. I think some things are hyper specific. But when we're talking about higher cognition and neocortical cognition, when we start getting into the gray matter around the edge, right? That's a higher level of computation because you've got these whopping great big columns of neurons doing stuff, and they're very similar, right? These structures are very similar, they're just in different places. So then you get different network effects. So it really depends. We talk about the brain as this one thing, and that is so profoundly inaccurate. Like the brain is not a single organ. It just looks like one a little bit, kind of, because you can cut it out like one basically from a body. But the amount of structure and detail in the brain area of the body, shall we say, is so crazy. There's so much going on in there that really you do need to start talking about like the different organs. And I think in the neocortex, the hyperlocalization is probably less, like things are less specialized in the neocortex, I believe, based on this recent research. Whereas when you start getting it down into the thalamus and other areas like that, it becomes more specialized. And what's interesting about the cerebellum is that people used to think the cerebellum was really old, but actually the latest evidence shows that latest evidence, what I've been reading suggests that it evolved alongside the neocortex. So even though it's at the bottom of the brain and you think it's like, oh, this has got to be like reptilian brain, it's like, no. That really exploded alongside the neocortex. So it's like as our neocortical brain became good at high level model building and like high level processing, not just reactive, hyper specific stuff, but like general purpose stuff, it needed this other area to do like fast pattern crunching. And that's the cerebellum. So it's a bit like a computer, actually. I don't like using this metaphor usually, but like the CPU does a lot of work, but the GPU does a lot of maths faster. So if you wanted to like solve, like if you wanted to paint a picture or something like that, it's actually faster to get the GPU to paint the picture because it just does it. Whereas the CPU would have to work it out. But in a computer, you have loads of other bits that aren't CPUs or GPUs that do specific things, that manage specific things. And that's like the lower brain.
One thing that is clear that the cerebellum is also involved in is language processing, which they did tests on where people with autism and people without autism were doing semantic tests. So we're doing semantic processing of language, where specific areas of the cerebellum were activated in neurotypical people and were not activated or very low activated in people with autism. So like less effective semantic processing. And like this is one of the things the cerebellum is involved with, but
yeah, definitely,
it's involved in all kinds of processes that also became much more complicated with evolving as a human species.
I think just very
such as language.
All of the higher level stuff, like at some level, like we talk a lot, and we have talked a lot in the last few weeks about like inhibition and excitation, like, you know, those traffic lights, like slowing stuff down or speeding it up. Or it's like a lot of it is regulation, right? It's like, it's not as simple as like, oh, there's a thing that does a thing. It's like, oh, there's a thing that can do this stuff, but it kind of wants to do it too much. So you need a load of stuff to slow it down or speed it up or make sure it goes in the right direction. Like a lot of the brain is actually kind of like guardrails for stuff. And I think if the neocortex could just do whatever it wanted, it would just be crazy. I think, you know, things like epilepsy, schizophrenia, like Alzheimer's, like these sort of neurological experiences that are just like something is going over the top, right? That's the sort of stuff that you get when you're just trying to crunch patterns in this really high level stuff. You need something that damps it down, smooths it, does the number crunching in a way that doesn't like overwhelm. Giving a really concrete example, and this is something that people with autism will experience, is crunching social data. So when you're in a social environment, the amount of information that's flowing around about social expectations, cultural expectations, relational dynamics, it's vast. Like it's crazy and it's subtle and it's complex and there's no right answers, right? You can't solve it. There's just these vibes and these like, whoa, what's going on and like stuff. Okay. If you have to process that, like without any assistance, you'll be like, man, that's a lot of information. I need to think about that for a bit. Okay, so I mean that implies that, right? But by the time you've thought about that, like, you know, a 3-second exchange where everyone's just giving each other eyes and someone said something, you're like, oh my God, something's happened, right? If you have to work that out, you know, you could write an essay or a PhD on that 5-second moment and analyze it intensely. And it's hilarious because we actually do this in therapy training. You know, you can take a 5-second conversation and analyze the absolute sin out of it. But in real world setting, if you do that, you've just fallen out of the conversation because you're not keeping up, because this stuff doesn't stop for you. It just carries on. The next 5 seconds has already arrived. You can't afford to think about this stuff. You have to just be able to live it and experience it. And that's where the cerebellum comes in. So neurotypicals, they use their cerebellum and they learn this in their teenage years. And they learn the structures, they learn the rules, they learn the, like I think a lot of times autistic people say like, it's like everyone else has like this rule book about how to behave. And like, I just don't have it. That's the cerebellum, right? That learnt during your teenage and childhood years what those rules were. And they're not true rules, they're just models. And everyone makes their own model and they call it common sense. And it's like, no, this is just your brain learning something that means it won't have to think about it anymore. And that's what neurotypical people do in conversation. They don't think about the conversation, they just live it. Whereas autistic people go, I have to think about this. And it's
And probably give it back to the ACC.
yeah, and they give it back, and then it's like, how do I do this with the other parts of my brain that are just slower at doing this? And if I do that, what else did I just throw away? Right? What was the energy trade off? Like, what did I give up to be able to do this? And the reality is, if you're autistic, because the cerebellum is so challenged at doing this, autistic people often just give up on the social stuff and be like, I'm just not doing that. What else? Where else can I kind of cope? And it's like, okay, well, patterns, numbers, words, some other domain of interest, and you go hyper on that because you can do it. It's safe. It's achievable.
Because it's doable to make a model of it and
Yeah, and your
make it
brain wants to
comprehensible.
do its job. It just can't do that job. So yeah, that's a little bit of a passionate point for me where I'm like, this is kind of why people with autism struggle so much with. And I think that the experience, I've spoken with so many people with autism are like, yeah, right? Like I have to think about social stuff in real time. Are you kidding me? That's exhausting and impossible. But that's what we're trying to do because our cerebellum, for whatever reason, isn't doing the job for us. But that's what it exists to do.
And apparently that has multiple levels. So one thing is that it has less gray mass. It also has less Purkinje cells that are the output of the cerebellum to other parts of the brain. Apparently there's also less connections with other prefrontal parts of the brain that have also been impaired by dysregulated glutamate.
Which is kind of what you expect. Because if you're not using it, why would your brain invest in it? Your brain won't invest in building it out. It's like, the famously the taxi drivers in London, there's a part of their brain that grows really big because they have to remember every street in London. It's a kind of a little bit like that. So I don't know, and I don't think anyone really knows whether this is because of a genetic reason that makes it impossible for it to grow, or a developmental reason where it's like because it doesn't work, the brain doesn't invest in it growing. So because of the experience of the human being in their environment going, I can't, like I'm already failing at this right from the word go, therefore I'm not going to invest in it right from the word go, which means that after some years you look and go, this isn't there. And it's like, well, yeah, it's because the brain didn't bother growing it.
Or whether there's a neuroinflammation process going on, which is destroying all the things that have been generated.
Good point. Yeah. Which begs a question, like, I think we talked about it a few sessions ago. I can't remember what it was though. Something about if you do certain things with autistic children, it mitigates their symptoms. Do you remember that? Do you remember what we said
Yes.
about?
Wasn't there inflammation dampening
If you give them,
medications?
it wasn't steroids. It was, oh man, I wish we could remember this because the question there is if it is actually developmental and if we can find a way of supporting autistic brains in early life to be able to process that stuff, like
Wasn't it
yes, vitamin D, that was it. Yeah. So if we can support whatever deficits that there are that cause that with autistic children or neurodiverse children, then if the brain wants to grow it but just can't, if we provide support there, maybe they can. And that then begs a massive question of whether we talk about autism as a disability or a neurotype or that's a whole can of cultural worms. But if I could go back and if I knew that there was a way of supporting my brain to grow in certain ways that were going to make life easier, like functionally just easier, man, that would be tempting. I'd find it hard not to choose that.
especially if it has the shape of a vitamin and not a proper medication? Just like things that are generally there's a difference, right, between medication and vitamins.
I love how in the States, the FDA draws a really strong distinction between food and drugs. And they've got this really dumb definition somewhere. I can't remember exactly, but it's like, oh, foods are not drugs because they don't have an impact on the body. Something that's like, what? Like everything you put in your face and swallow has an impact on your body. Like there is no difference. It's just like, there's a spectrum of like
Then they
intensity
don't have any food in the US.
or the other way around. Maybe they don't have drugs. Are they war on food? Culturally, they kind of do. Anyway, that's a little bit tangential.
Yeah. Do you have anything to add?
I'm curious. So I've got like 3 sort of distinct phases of curiosity in my life, maybe 4. And at university, I was very into the neuroscience, and some of what we're doing here, I'm like, oh yeah, that really rings bells. Like when you were talking about liver and kidney glutamate, I was like, I've heard that before. But then I have to sometimes, hunt a bit to remember like that, like all the neuroscience that I know, right? Like not the stuff I've read about recently, but like the history of it. And then I went and did like after university or sort of during the end of university, lots of sort of spiritual stuff. I was very interested in the shamanic stuff. And I kind of like explored the world from that perspective and was reading lots of like Eastern scholars and Native American traditions, like wisdom traditions. I was looking for knowledge, not so much from Western culture, but from other cultures. And then I did the whole psychotherapy training stuff, which is because I actually went to South America and like went to the shamans and was like, yes, I'm going to learn to be a shaman. And I realized this is so ridiculous. Like my shamanic tradition in my culture, if I wasn't appropriating anything, is psychotherapy. So I came back and was like, I'll study that, which actually hilariously appropriates a hell of a lot of knowledge from around the world. Like a lot of psychotherapy models or histories are like, yes, we invented this idea, and it's like they've been doing that in Africa for fucking ages. Like you just copied it. Like you didn't invent it. Classic white person arrogance. But
Which is still fine if it works. I mean, if
yeah,
you
I'm
don't
kind of like,
claim that you invented it, but
I think,
still.
yeah, there's a kind of historical honesty that can be brought in, but it doesn't change the efficacy, right? So I did that, and then I got into neurodiversity and sort of have come back to being really interested in the neuroscience. But in that, I have been really focused so far mostly on like dopamine, cerebellum, basal ganglia. And I think the prefrontal cortex is super, super interesting. And I feel like we covered it a little bit. We talked about it a little bit, and we're like, yes, it's about regulation and stuff. But there's so much that it does. I'm wondering whether it might be interesting to do a deep dive on just the prefrontal cortex, like really go into that and go like, whoa, what's going on there? And the other one that I mentioned earlier on is the idea that stuff is located in certain parts of the brain, specifically neocortical stuff, right? If that's being challenged by recent research, can we do like a little discovery loop and find out who and why and what is saying that might not be the best way of understanding the neocortex? Because that's pretty cutting edge stuff, and I think that could be fun to talk about.
You are referring to the different areas of the brain are doing a specific thing for doing
Yes.
everything,
So
distributing.
the recent research that suggests that maybe it's not as simple as that, and that there's like more layers we need to know about, or more perspectives we need to explore around stuff. It's not just like, oh, this area does this. It's kind of like a house, like you might have certain functions that you sleep in one room and you watch telly in one room and you do your work in one room and you cook in one. But where do you have a happy evening in your house? Well, a happy evening might involve starting in the kitchen and making some food, and then sitting in the dining room or wherever you sit to eat it and share it. Maybe you need to go to the loo after that. And then maybe you need to spend some time on the sofa with your friend. Like that's 4 rooms already like involved. But the outcome is my enjoyable evening routine rather than, hey, I heat food here. Right. So it depends on what it is we're looking at. I heat food here. Well, that happens in the kitchen. But I heat food here. How meaningful is that as a question compared to, where do I do my morning routine? Maybe that happens in multiple parts of the house as well. What does it take to get out the door in the morning? That's like almost every room in the house gets involved in that, right? So I think what we're looking at, what phenomenon we're interested in, and how that maps to, is it a place in the brain, or is it actually like is it a much more complex thing?
Maybe what it could translate to in the brain, like, could still mean that specific parts of the brain are still doing specific things, but that we are currently translating them to much broader concepts. Like, for example, language processing, that maybe a specific part of the brain is involved in reading a character, but that a different part of the brain is involved in making a sentence, and that maybe a different part is involved in pronouncing the words, and that for the whole concept of language understanding and processing is done in all of the brain almost.
Yeah. So where do you speak from is a very different question from all those little components that you just identified. And there's going to be like small components that do things like, I don't know, maybe like syntax ordering. But there'll also be like higher level processes that go like inhibition of social acceptability. It's like you don't just say everything that comes to your mind, because you're like, that would be really foolish, right? If you just spoke without filter, that'd be nuts. Although some people do, so maybe their filter is not working that great. So it's not even just the mechanics. It's like there's layers on layers on layers of like different worlds of meaning, and something as simple as speak a sentence actually may have a lot of stuff going on in it, both at the low level and also like top down, high level regulatory needs. So yeah, I would, those are two areas that I feel I would like to know more about.
Sounds good.
Well, let's find out what we find out.
See you next week.
Thanks for listening to our podcast today. If you like what we're talking about and want to hear more, do like, follow, and subscribe. It makes a really big difference. You can also find us on social media and our Patreon, Al and Merrill, or our website, alanmerrill.com. Thanks for listening. Catch you next time.